Ashes of Justice, Disbarred Lawyer Audiobook, A Legal Redemption Story. Chapter 1. The Apex and the Abyss. The scent of money in Los Angeles was a heady perfume Marcus Thorne had cultivated a connoisseur's nose for. It clung to the polished leather of his bespoke Italian shoes, permeated the crisp linen of his tailored suits, and shimmered in the crystal flutes of the champagne he invariably served at his penthouse soiree. At 38, Marcus was not just a lawyer. He was a brand, a force, a name whispered with a mixture of awe and trepidation in the gilded halls of family court. Thorne and Associates wasn't just a firm, it was a fortress, built brick by brick on the ruins of broken marriages and the spoils of meticulously dissected assets. His office, perched on the 40th floor of a Century City skyscraper, was a testament to his reign. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic sprawl of the city, from the shimmering Pacific to the distant, hazy mountains. On his desk, nestled amongst meticulously organized files and a gleaming MacBook Pro, sat a framed Forbes article featuring him, titled The Divorce Dynamo, Marcus Thorne's Unyielding Pursuit of Victory. The accompanying photo, a carefully curated shot of Marcus with a confident, almost predatory glint in his eyes, was a constant, silent affirmation. Today, however, the usual hum of triumph in the office felt strained, almost discordant. The air conditioning, usually a soothing balm, seemed to carry a faint, metallic tang, like fear. Marcus leaned back in his ergonomic chair, the supple leather groaning softly in protest. Across the polished mahogany, his client, Cassandra Vance, a woman whose former husband, a tech titan named Julian Vance, was making her life a living hell, wrung her hands. "He's hiding everything, Marcus," Cassandra wailed, her voice a fragile whisper against the city's roar. "I know it. The offshore accounts, the crypto, he's funneling it all away. If we can't prove it, I'll be left with nothing. Nothing." Marcus steepled his fingers, his gaze unwavering. He knew Julian Vance, a shark, even by Silicon Valley standards. He had seen the preliminary financial disclosures, a masterpiece of obfuscation. Julian had declared a net worth that seemed laughably small for a man who'd founded a billion-dollar startup. Marcus had his suspicions, his gut screaming foul play, but suspicions weren't evidence, and evidence, in the cutthroat world of high-net-worth divorce, was everything. "We will find it, Cassandra," Marcus said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble that had calmed countless distraught clients. It was a practiced cadence, honed over years of delivering promises he always intended to keep, by any means necessary. "Trust me." But even as he spoke the words, a cold knot tightened in his stomach. The case was dragging. Julian Vance was proving to be a formidable opponent, his legal team a phalanx of equally ruthless litigators. Discovery had hit a wall. Julian's financial records were cleaner than a surgeon's scalpel, too clean. Marcus had spent weeks, months, chasing ghosts, poring over ledgers, hiring forensic accountants who came up empty-handed. The firm's resources were stretched thin, and more importantly, Marcus's reputation, his very brand, was on the line. Losing this case wasn't an option. It would be a crack in the fortress, a chink in the armor. That night, the penthouse was a blur of flashing lights and synthetic laughter. The bass thumped through the floor, vibrating up into Marcus's bones, a familiar rhythm that usually drowned out the incessant hum of his anxieties. Models with vacant eyes drifted past, their designer dresses shimmering. Junior partners, eager to impress, plied him with expensive scotch. This was his escape, his carefully constructed facade. The hard partying wasn't just for show. It was a shield, a distraction from the gnawing emptiness that sometimes threatened to consume him when the music died and the city lights blurred into a lonely expanse. He caught a glimpse of himself in the polished chrome of the bar. The sharp jawline, the expensive haircut, the tailored suit. It was the image of success, the man who had pulled himself up from nothing. But in the depths of his own eyes, he saw a flicker of something else. Exhaustion, a desperate hunger for control. He had always been driven, always needed to win. It was what made him great, and what, he was beginning to realize, might be his undoing. A text message buzzed in his pocket. It was from his lead forensic accountant, a terse, one-line update. Still nothing on Vance. He's cleaner than clean. Marcus excused himself from a conversation about yacht prices, the forced smile on his face dissolving into a grimace as he moved to the quieter solitude of his balcony. The city lights below twinkled like scattered diamonds, indifferent to his mounting desperation. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through old emails, old documents. He knew Julian Vance had a hidden account, a shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands. He had a strong, unshakable intuition. He just couldn't prove it, not with the evidence he had. Then his thumb hovered over an attachment. It was an old, unfiled draft of Julian Vance's initial financial disclosure, sent by a disgruntled former employee of Vance's a few months ago, before the official filings. It contained an itemized list of several offshore holdings, including the Cayman Islands entity, that were conspicuously absent from the official document. At the time, Marcus had dismissed it as a preliminary draft, perhaps an error or a test. Now, a dark, insidious thought began to take root in his mind. He knew intellectually the gravity of what he was considering. California Penal Code 115, filing a false or forged document, a felony. It was a white-collar fraud crime, and for a lawyer, a direct path to disbarment. He had lectured clients on the perils of perjury, on the sanctity of sworn declarations. He had built his career on upholding the law, even as he bent it to his will. But this was different. This was outright fabrication. His mind raced a whirlwind of justifications. Julian Vance was hiding assets. Marcus knew it. He was just evening the playing field. This wasn't about greed. It was about justice, or at least his twisted version of it. The system was rigged, he told himself. Sometimes you had to break a few rules to make things right. And besides, who would ever know? It was a simple swap, a few lines of text in a PDF. He could make it look like a clerical error, a late discovery. He was a master of plausible deniability. He remembered the specific elements of PC 115 from law school, knowingly filing such an instrument with a California government office. The prosecution must establish that the defendant knew the document was false or forged at the time of its submission. He would be knowingly submitting a document he had altered, making it appear as if Julian Vance had originally filed it. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He closed his eyes, picturing Cassandra Vance's tear-stained face, her desperate plea. He pictured the Forbes article, the pride, the empire he had built. He couldn't lose. He wouldn't. He walked back inside, the music now a dull throb, the laughter distant. He nodded to a junior associate, forced a smile, and made his way to his private study, a room rarely used for anything but quiet contemplation, or, more often, late-night strategizing. He powered on his personal laptop, the screen glowing eerily in the dark room. He opened the draft document. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, a tremor running through them. This wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a moral precipice. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The city lights outside seemed to mock him. Countless eyes that would never know the secret he was about to commit. He thought of the consequences, the disbarment, the prison time, the utter destruction of everything he had worked for. But then, another thought, more powerful, more seductive, the taste of victory, the vindication, the preservation of his carefully constructed world. His fingers moved, swift and decisive. He opened the official financial disclosure document, the one Julian Vance had filed. With a few clicks, a few deft edits, he began to transpose the hidden offshore accounts from the draft onto the official filing. He meticulously matched fonts, spacing, and formatting. It was a digital sleight of hand, a forgery so precise it would be almost impossible to detect without a forensic deep dive. He would then submit the corrected document to the court, claiming it was a new discovery, a belated amendment. As he worked, a strange calm settled over him. The tremor in his hands subsided. The moral alarm bells, once blaring, now faded to a distant hum. He was a lawyer. He fixed problems, and this was just another problem, albeit one that required a particularly creative solution. When he was done, he reviewed the document. It looked perfect, flawless. The evidence he needed, now officially part of the court record. He saved the file, then deleted the original draft and any traces of his work. A ghost in the machine. He closed the laptop, the screen going dark, plunging the room back into silence. The party still raged outside, a muffled roar of celebration. He stood there, alone in the quiet darkness, the city lights his only witnesses. He had won. He had secured Cassandra Vance's future, and in doing so, he believed, secured his own. But as he walked back toward the noise and the light, a cold, unsettling certainty settled over him. He had crossed a line, and the ground beneath his feet, once so solid, now felt like ash. The apex of his career had just become the edge of his abyss. Chapter 2. The Unraveling. The initial days after Marcus submitted the altered financial disclosure were a deceptive calm. Cassandra Vance's divorce case took a dramatic turn. The newly discovered offshore accounts, meticulously woven into Julian Vance's official filings, sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Julian Vance's legal team, initially dismissive, scrambled. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense arbiter known for her intolerance of financial subterfuge, looked at Julian Vance with a gaze that promised retribution. Cassandra, for the first time in months, smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that momentarily made Marcus feel a flicker of satisfaction. He had delivered, but the victory felt hollow, tainted by the secret knowledge of his transgression. He found himself checking the news obsessively, scanning legal blogs, waiting for the other shoe to drop. He told himself it was paranoia, the lingering adrenaline of the high-stakes gamble. No one could possibly know. He was too good. The first tremor came a week later, a cryptic email from the State Bar of California, a formal inquiry regarding certain discrepancies in a recent filing. It was boilerplate, innocuous on the surface, but Marcus's blood ran cold. He dismissed it as routine, a minor administrative hiccup, and drafted a bland, legally dense response. Then came the phone call. It was from District Attorney Eleanor Vance. No relation to Julian Vance, but a formidable prosecutor Marcus knew by reputation, sharp, unyielding, and with a particular disdain for white-collar crime. Mr. Thorne, her voice was clipped, devoid of pleasantries. My office is initiating an investigation into the financial disclosures filed in Vance v. Vance, specifically the amended filing of 2 weeks ago. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. On what grounds, Ms. Vance? The document was submitted in good faith, based on newly acquired information. He tried to sound indignant, but his voice wavered slightly. We have reason to believe the document was falsified, she stated, her tone flat, unwavering. A forensic analysis has revealed anomalies, and we have a witness. A witness. The words echoed in his head, a death knell. His mind raced, trying to pinpoint who it could be. The disgruntled former employee? Unlikely. They had no direct knowledge of his actions. A junior associate? Impossible. He had worked alone. That's preposterous, Marcus scoffed, attempting to regain his composure. My firm adheres to the highest ethical standards. This is a baseless accusation, Ms. Vance. I suggest you reconsider before you damage a reputable firm's name." "Save the bluster, Mr. Thorne," she retorted, a hint of steel in her voice. "We have a warrant. Expect a visit." The line went dead. The visit came 2 days later, not just from the district attorney's office, but from the FBI. Marcus was in his office, reviewing a brief, when the glass doors of Thorne and Associates slid open, revealing a phalanx of agents in dark suits. The usual hushed reverence of the firm was shattered by the sharp commands, the flashing badges, the sudden, terrifying reality of his world imploding. "Marcus Thorne," an agent with a grim face asked, holding up a badge. "We have a warrant to search these premises and seize all relevant documents and electronic devices pertaining to the Vance vs. Vance case and your personal financial records." Marcus felt a cold dread spread through him, paralyzing him. He watched, helpless, as agents swarmed his pristine office, meticulously bagging files, confiscating his gleaming MacBook Pro, even his personal cell phone. The Forbes article on his desk seemed to mock him, its triumphant headline now a cruel irony. The next few weeks were a blur of legal maneuvering, frantic phone calls to his own high-priced defense attorneys, and the steady drip of public humiliation. The news cycle, once his ally, became his tormentor. L.A. divorce king under investigation. Thorne and Associates raided by FBI. Allegations of forgery rock legal world. His name, once synonymous with success, was now dragged through the mud. His defense attorneys, initially confident, grew increasingly grim. The forensic evidence was damning. The digital fingerprints of his edits, though subtle, were undeniable. And the witness, it wasn't the disgruntled former employee. It was a low-level court clerk, a nervous young woman who had noticed a discrepancy in the metadata of the amended filing and, fearing repercussions, had quietly flagged it. Her testimony, combined with the forensic analysis, created an unassailable case. Marcus's arrogance, his belief in his own untouchability, had been his fatal flaw. The grand jury indictment came swiftly. Marcus Thorne, charged with felony violation of California Penal Code 115, filing a false or forged document. The formal reading of the charges was a public spectacle. Reporters jostled for position outside the courthouse, cameras flashing, microphones thrust into his face. He walked through a gauntlet of judgment, his head held high, a mask of defiance concealing the terror churning within him. His arraignment was even worse. He stood before the judge, the same one who had presided over Cassandra Vance's divorce, her gaze now filled not with professional impartiality, but with a chilling disappointment. He pleaded not guilty, a lie that felt like ash in his mouth. Bail was set impossibly high, a clear signal of the court's view of his flight risk and the severity of his alleged crime. The legal community, once his adoring audience, turned its back with astonishing speed. Clients pulled their cases citing loss of confidence. Junior partners, once eager to emulate him, began to distance themselves, their whispers of moral turpitude reaching his ears. Thorne and Associates, the fortress he had built, began to crumble. The firm's reputation, once unblemished, was now irrevocably tainted. Lawyers he had mentored, colleagues he had once dined with, now avoided eye contact, their faces a mixture of pity and thinly veiled schadenfreude. The State Bar of California moved with ruthless efficiency. A felony conviction, especially one involving fraud and dishonesty, was considered a crime of moral turpitude, a direct violation of the ethical standards required of attorneys. The disciplinary proceedings were swift, almost perfunctory. Marcus's defense, that he was merely correcting a wrong, that Julian Vance was hiding assets, fell on deaf ears. The fact that he had knowingly filed a false document was the only thing that mattered. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a thick envelope with the State Bar's seal. He knew what it contained before he even opened it. The formal notice of his disbarment, his license to practice law, the very foundation of his identity, revoked permanently. He was no longer Marcus Thorne, attorney at law. He was just Marcus Thorne, a man stripped of his profession, his reputation, his purpose. He sat in his now empty office, the panoramic view of the city no longer a symbol of his triumph, but a mocking reminder of his fall. The Forbes article still on his desk seemed to stare back at him, its bold headline a cruel whisper of a life he no longer possessed. He picked up the framed article, his fingers tracing the confident lines of his younger self. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he hurled it against the wall. The glass shattered, scattering shards across the expensive rug, each piece reflecting a distorted fragment of his ruined life. The phone rang. It was his lead defense attorney, his voice grave. "Marcus, the plea deal is still on the table. They're offering a reduced sentence if you plead guilty. Otherwise, the DA is going for the maximum. With the evidence, it's a certainty." Marcus stared at the shattered glass, the glittering fragments of his former glory. He had always fought, always won. But now there was no fight left, only the cold, hard reality of his choices. He closed his eyes, picturing the stark concrete walls of a prison cell, a future he had never imagined, a world utterly devoid of the power and privilege he had once commanded. The abyss had finally swallowed him whole. Chapter 3: Concrete and Chains. The courtroom was a theater of the absurd, a stage where Marcus Thorne, once the star performer, was now merely a prop. The air, usually thick with the scent of ambition and expensive cologne, now reeked of stale coffee and desperation. His defense attorneys, two grim-faced men who had once charged exorbitant fees for their services, now looked like pallbearers. They had urged him to take the plea, to accept the reduced sentence, but a stubborn, suicidal pride had clung to him. He was Marcus Thorne. He didn't plead. He won. But the prosecution, led by Eleanor Vance, had been relentless. The forensic evidence, the metadata, the court clerk's trembling testimony, it was an airtight case. His hard partying lifestyle, once a badge of his success and carefree abandon, had been subtly twisted by the prosecution. It wasn't just about the false document, they argued. It was about a pattern of reckless disregard, a man who believed himself above the rules, whose moral compass had been dulled by excess. His attempts to portray the altered document as a mistake of fact or an accidental filing had crumbled under the weight of his own carefully constructed image. The jury, a cross-section of ordinary Angelenos, had seen through the polished facade to the rot beneath. The verdict, when it came, was a dull thud, not a thunderclap. Guilty. Marcus felt a strange detachment, as if watching a scene unfold from a great distance. The murmurs in the gallery, the flash of cameras, the sympathetic glance from his junior attorney, it all seemed muted, unreal. He was Marcus Thorne, and Marcus Thorne did not lose. Yet, here he was, undeniably, irrevocably lost. Sentencing day arrived, a gray, overcast Tuesday that mirrored the landscape of his soul. He stood before Judge Albright, the same judge who had presided over the Vance versus Vance divorce. Her face, usually impassive, held a flicker of something akin to sorrow, or perhaps profound disappointment. "Mr. Thorne," her voice resonated through the silent courtroom, each word a hammer blow. "You stood before this court as an officer of the law, sworn to uphold its principles. Instead, you chose to subvert them, to engage in a deliberate act of fraud that strikes at the very heart of our justice system. Your actions, particularly given your position and knowledge, represent a grave breach of trust." She recounted the details of Penal Code 115, the elements of the crime, the impact of his actions. She spoke of the moral turpitude inherent in his conviction, a phrase that felt like a brand on his skin. Marcus stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. He was still Marcus Thorne, even if the world around him was crumbling. Considering the severity of the offense, the clear intent to defraud, and the need to deter others from similar conduct, I hereby sentence you, Marcus Thorne, to 2 years in state prison. 2 years. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Not the maximum 3, but enough. Enough to shatter everything. Enough to make the disbarment, already a crushing blow, feel like a mere prelude. A fine of $10,000 was added, a paltry sum compared to his former wealth, but a stinging reminder of his new status. The gavel fell, a sharp final crack that echoed in the sudden silence. It was done. The abyss had not just swallowed him, it had sealed him in. The journey from the courthouse to the reception center was a blur of cuffs, a cramped transport van, and the chilling realization that his freedom was gone. He was no longer Marcus Thorne, the powerful attorney. He was inmate number BJ11381. His designer suit was replaced by a flimsy jumpsuit. His expensive watch, his rings, his wallet, all confiscated. He was stripped bare, physically and metaphorically. The reception center was a cacophony of shouts, clanging metal, and the pervasive smell of disinfectant and stale sweat. It was a dehumanizing process. Endless lines, shouted instructions, medical checks, and the constant, unnerving presence of other inmates, their faces a mixture of resignation, anger, and a chilling emptiness. Marcus, accustomed to commanding respect, found himself just another number, herded like cattle. After what felt like an eternity, he was processed and assigned to California Men's Colony, CMC, a state prison in San Luis Obispo. He had vaguely heard of it, a place sometimes referred to as a country club among prisons, known for its programs. A faint, desperate hope flickered. Perhaps it wouldn't be so bad. Perhaps he could navigate this too, like he navigated everything else. The transfer to CMC was another jarring ride. As the bus pulled up to the imposing gates, the country club illusion evaporated. High fences topped with razor wire, guard towers, and the cold, unyielding architecture of incarceration greeted him. He was assigned to the East Facility, the medium security section. No open dormitories here, just concrete cells, individual and isolating. His new home was a stark 6-by-9-foot cell, a metal bunk, a thin mattress, a bolted-down toilet and sink. No view, no privacy. The air was stale, the light fluorescent and harsh. The sounds were overwhelming, distant shouts, the clang of cell doors, the low hum of unseen machinery, and the constant, unnerving presence of other human beings, separated by thin walls, but never truly alone. The first few days were a brutal assault on his senses and his psyche. The rigid schedule was suffocating. Wake-up calls at 6 a.m., communal meals in a loud, chaotic dining hall, limited yard time, and the endless mind-numbing hours locked in his cell. He, who had once dictated his own schedule, now lived by the unforgiving rhythm of the institution. He tried to maintain his composure, his lawyerly detachment. He observed, he analyzed, he tried to find the angles. But there were no angles here. Only rules and consequences for breaking them. His attempts to assert himself, to use his intellect or his former status, were met with blank stares from guards or derisive laughter from inmates. "You ain't special here, hotshot," a burly inmate with a neck tattoo had grunted on his first day in the yard. "We all wear the same pajamas." The hard partying aspect of his past, which the prosecution had used to paint him as reckless, now felt like a cruel joke. The emptiness he had tried to fill with champagne and fleeting encounters was now a gaping void, amplified by the crushing solitude. He missed the noise, the distractions, the constant stimulation that had kept his inner demons at bay. Now, in the silence of his cell, they roared. He lay on his bunk at night, staring at the concrete ceiling, the thin mattress offering little comfort. The sounds of the prison filtered through the walls. Coughs, snores, the occasional distant cry. He thought of his penthouse, the city lights, the life he had so carelessly thrown away. He thought of Cassandra Vance, her grateful smile, and the cold, hard fact that he had achieved that victory through deceit. The irony was a bitter pill. The initial arrogance that had fueled his downfall slowly began to crack, replaced by a creeping despair. He had always been in control. Now he was utterly powerless. He was just another inmate, another statistic. His identity, once so intricately woven into his profession, had been stripped away, leaving him raw and exposed. The country club prison was still a prison, and for Marcus Thorne, the golden cage had been replaced by concrete and chains. The abyss had swallowed him, and now it was beginning to digest him. He had to find a way out, not just physically, but spiritually. But how? The thought felt impossible in the suffocating silence of his cell. Chapter 4. A Spark of Hope. The initial weeks in the East Facility of California Men's Colony were a monotonous, soul-crushing cycle. Marcus Thorne, once a man who commanded rooms with a glance, found himself reduced to a series of rote movements. Wake, eat, limited yard time, eat, limited program time, eat, lock down. The fluorescent lights hummed incessantly, a constant irritating reminder of his confinement. The air, recycled and stale, tasted of despair. His cell, BJ11381, became both his tormentor and his sanctuary. In its cramped confines, there was no escape from his own thoughts. The hard-partying facade he'd maintained in Los Angeles had crumbled, leaving him exposed to the raw, unvarnished truth of his actions. He replayed the moments leading up to his crime, the arrogant certainty, the desperate need to win, the casual disregard for the law he was sworn to uphold. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. He, the architect of intricate legal strategies, was now trapped in a system designed to strip away all agency. He tried to read, but the words blurred. He tried to write, but his thoughts were a chaotic jumble of anger, regret, and a terrifying emptiness. He saw the other inmates, some resigned, some simmering with rage, some simply vacant. He felt a profound isolation, a chasm separating him from their lives, their stories. He was a lawyer, a man of intellect and privilege, now reduced to the same status as those he had once prosecuted or defended with a detached professionalism. His attempts at maintaining his former persona were met with swift, brutal corrections. He tried to argue a point with the guard about a procedural irregularity during mealtime, only to be met with a cold stare and a warning that landed him in solitary for a day. He tried to offer legal advice to a fellow inmate, only to be told, "Save it, counselor. You're in here with us now." The message was clear. His past meant nothing here. His intellect was useless. His name was just a number. The despair was a heavy blanket, suffocating him. He ate, slept, and existed, a ghost of his former self. His body, once meticulously maintained with expensive gym memberships and personal trainers, began to soften, the muscles atrophying from disuse. His mind, once sharp and agile, felt sluggish, dulled by the monotony. One afternoon, during the brief yard time, Marcus noticed a different kind of inmate. They moved with a purpose, a lean, almost restless energy that set them apart from the shuffling, despondent figures around him. Their jumpsuits, though identical in cut, seemed to hang differently, as if imbued with a subtle dignity. They often gathered in a corner of the yard, talking in low tones, occasionally demonstrating calisthenics or stretches. He looked healthier, more alive. He overheard snippets of their conversations. Fire season's coming. Got my 2-for-1s last month. Camp transfer next cycle. Fire. Camp. The word sparked a faint curiosity in his dulled mind. He had read about California's inmate firefighting programs in the news, but they had always seemed like a distant, abstract concept, something for other people, certainly not for a white-collar felon like him. One day, driven by a desperate need for any kind of change, Marcus approached a group of these inmates. He chose an older man with a weathered face and eyes that held a quiet strength. "Excuse me," Marcus began, his voice rusty from disuse. "I've noticed you and your colleagues. You seem different. What is it you do?" The man, whose name was Hector, looked him over, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "We're fire crew, new fish. Or we're trying to be. Conservation camp program." "Fire camp," Marcus echoed. "What's that entail?" Hector leaned against the chain-link fence, his gaze sweeping over the yard. "It means you work hard, you fight fires, you do conservation work. It means you earn your way out. Faster. Faster." The word resonated in Marcus's mind like a bell. "Faster how?" "Credits," Hector explained, his voice low. "Good conduct, program participation. But the real game changer is fire crew. 2 days off your sentence for every 1 day you serve on the line. 2 for 1. You get good, you get out." Marcus's mind, dormant for weeks, suddenly whirred to life. 2 for 1. That meant his 2-year sentence could be cut dramatically. The idea, initially dismissed as impossible, now held a tantalizing promise. He remembered the document he'd read in passing about the program, the mention of enhanced credits. "What are the requirements?" Marcus pressed, a flicker of his old lawyerly intensity returning. Hector eyed him, a skeptical glint in his eye. "You gotta be minimum custody, no violent record, no arson, no sex offenses, and you gotta pass the physical. It ain't no walk in the park, counselor. They break you down before they build you up." Minimum custody. Marcus knew he was currently in medium security. That meant he had to demonstrate sustained good behavior, adherence to rules, and active participation in rehabilitative programming. His recent stint in solitary for arguing with a guard flashed through his mind. He had a long way to go. And the physical? He was a lawyer, not an athlete. His physical training had involved lifting cocktail glasses and signing checks for personal trainers. Over the next few days, Marcus started observing Hector and the others more closely. He saw them doing push-ups, burpees, running laps in the small yard. He saw them studying, poring over manuals about fire science and first aid. He also noticed their demeanor. They carried themselves with a quiet discipline, a sense of purpose that was conspicuously absent in the general population. He started asking around, discreetly, about the program. He learned about the J-22R incarcerated person request form, the initial screening, the medical and mental clearance, the physical fitness test. He learned that his PC 115 felony, while serious, wasn't one of the automatic disqualifiers like murder or arson. This was a path open to him. The idea of physical labor, of manual work, was anathema to everything Marcus Thorne had been. He had built his empire with his mind, not his hands. The thought of sweating, of grime, of physical exhaustion was repellent, and the idea of being told what to do, of submitting to authority, was a bitter pill. His pride, though battered, was still a formidable barrier, but the alternative was worse. 2 years, possibly more, of this soul-crushing monotony, of being a nameless number in a concrete box. The thought of wasting his intellect, his life, in this sterile environment was unbearable. The hard partying past, which had once seemed so liberating, now felt like a childish indulgence that had led him directly to this cage. He realized that the emptiness he had tried to fill with external validation and fleeting pleasures was the very thing that had made him vulnerable to his own destructive choices. He began to consider the fire camp not as a punishment, but as a strategic maneuver. It was a means to an end, a way to reclaim some semblance of control over his sentence, over his future. He could use his intellect to master the program, to excel, just as he had excelled in law. It was a new kind of case, a new kind of challenge. That night, back in his cell, Marcus didn't just lie on his bunk. He started, tentatively, to do push-ups. 10, then 15, his muscles screaming in protest. He felt the burn, the unfamiliar ache, and for the first time in months, he felt something other than despair. He felt the faint stirrings of purpose, a spark in the overwhelming darkness. He was Marcus Thorne, and he was going to fight his way out. Not with legal loopholes, but with sweat, discipline, and a desperate, burning hope for redemption. The first step, however small, had been taken. Chapter 5. Into the Inferno. The transfer from CMC's East facility to the fire camp was less a journey and more a rude awakening. After weeks of tentative physical exertion in the yard, Marcus had managed to earn his minimum custody status, a small victory hard won through strict adherence to rules and a forced politeness towards the guards. He had submitted his J-22R form, passed the initial screenings, and he even managed to scrape through the basic medical clearance, though the doctor had raised an eyebrow at his sedentary past. The physical fitness test, a grueling series of push-ups, sit-ups, and a timed run, had nearly broken him, but the desperate hunger for a faster exit had propelled him through. Now, crammed into another transport van, this one less fortified than the prison bus, he felt a strange mix of trepidation and a nascent excitement. The landscape outside the window began to change, the urban sprawl giving way to rolling hills, then dense forests. The air, even through the vents, smelled cleaner, sharper, carrying the faint tang of pine and damp earth. The van pulled up to a cluster of low-slung buildings nestled deep within a clearing. This was his new home, West Facility's Level 1 yard. There were no towering fences, no razor wire, just a perimeter fence that seemed almost symbolic. It was a stark contrast to the concrete fortress he'd left behind, but the discipline here felt even more rigid, more self-imposed. Upon arrival, Marcus, along with a dozen other new recruits, was immediately thrown into the physical fitness training PFT program. It was a 2-week baptism by fire, designed to break down the weak and forge the resilient. The Cal Fire staff, lean and tanned, with eyes that had seen too many wildfires, were unforgiving. "You think you're tough, city boy?" A drill sergeant-like instructor named Miller barked, his voice hoarse from years of shouting over roaring flames. "You think your fancy degrees mean squat out here? This ain't no courtroom. Out here gravity's the only law, and fire don't care about your appeals." Marcus was pushed beyond anything he had ever experienced. Up at 0500, runs that stretched for miles through uneven terrain, endless sets of burpees, squats, and push-ups, until his muscles screamed in protest. He learned to carry heavy tools, Pulaskis, shovels, chainsaws, over long distances. His hands, once soft and manicured, became calloused and blistered. Every muscle ached, every breath burned. He pushed past the pain, past the nausea, driven by the memory of his cell, of the wasted time, and the tantalizing promise of those 2-for-1 credits. He thought of Hector, the older inmate from CMC, whose quiet strength now seemed like a beacon. He learned quickly that the fire camp wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about mental fortitude and, crucially, teamwork. Every drill, every exercise emphasized the crew. They ate together, trained together, suffered together. There was no room for individual brilliance, no space for the kind of lone wolf tactics Marcus had perfected in his legal career. He had to learn to rely on the man next to him, and, more painfully, to let the man next to him rely on him. His arrogance, once his defining characteristic, was slowly being chipped away, replaced by a grudging humility. After the PFT, came the Cal Fire Wildland Firefighting Training, FFT. 4 days of intensive classroom instruction, followed by 4 days of field training. Marcus, the intellectual, excelled in the classroom. He absorbed the information like a sponge. Fire behavior, safety protocols, chain of command, tool maintenance, first aid. He aced the written exams, a small, familiar comfort in this alien world. But the field training was different. It was hands-on, dirty, and dangerous. He learned how to dig fire lines, how to use a Pulaski to scrape away fuel down to mineral soil, how to fell small trees, how to backburn. He learned the language of fire, the way it runs, crowns, and spots. He learned to read the wind, the terrain, the vegetation. He learned that a small mistake could have catastrophic consequences. The abstract concepts of legal precedent and procedural rules were replaced by the very real, immediate consequences of a misstep in the field. He earned his Cal Fire Wildland Firefighting certification, a piece of paper that felt more earned, more substantial than any of his law degrees. Then came the call, the first one, a brush fire in the Angeles National Forest. Marcus's crew, Deadwood 7, was deployed. The air in the transport bus was thick with nervous energy, a mix of apprehension and adrenaline. As they approached the fire line, the sky turned an ominous orange, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning chaparral. His first glimpse of an active wildfire was terrifying, a roaring beast of flame, devouring everything in its path, sending plumes of black smoke into the sky. The heat was intense, even from a distance. The noise was deafening, the crackle and roar of the fire, the shouts of incident commanders, the thud of helicopters overhead. "All right, Deadwood 7, Miller yelled over the din, his face grim. "We're digging a handline on this flank. Keep your eyes up. Watch your spacing. No heroes. Work as a team." Marcus grabbed his Pulaski, its weight suddenly feeling immense. He fell into line, his heart pounding. The work was brutal, digging, scraping, chopping, clearing a path through the dense undergrowth, creating a break in the fuel that the fire needed to spread. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. Smoke burned his lungs. His muscles screamed, but he kept going, driven by the rhythm of the crew, the shared purpose. He saw a fellow inmate stumble, nearly falling into a burning bush. Without thinking, Marcus reached out, grabbing his arm, pulling him back. The inmate, a young man named Carlos, nodded a silent thanks, his eyes wide with fear and gratitude. In that moment, the chasm between Marcus and the other inmates seemed to shrink. They were just men, fighting a common enemy. They worked for hours, the sun setting, casting an eerie blood-red glow over the inferno. The exhaustion was absolute, bone deep. But there was also a strange sense of accomplishment, a primal satisfaction in battling such a raw, destructive force. When the fire was finally contained, the crew stood, blackened and exhausted, watching the smoldering embers. The air was still thick with smoke, but the roar had subsided, replaced by a low hiss. Back at camp, after a cold shower that barely touched the grime, Marcus felt a profound shift. He had faced a real tangible threat, not a legal abstraction. He had worked with his hands, not just his mind. He had relied on others, and they had relied on him. The arrogance that had once defined him seemed trivial, almost childish, in the face of the raw power of nature and the stark reality of survival. During periods without active fires, the crews engaged in conservation projects. These were less dramatic than firefighting, but equally demanding. They cleared brush for fuel reduction, maintained hiking trails, cleaned up parks, even helped with flood control. The work was monotonous, repetitive, but it forced Marcus into a meditative rhythm. As he swung a Pulaski or cleared debris, his mind, once racing with legal arguments and self-justifications, began to quiet. He thought about the false document, about Julian Vance, about Cassandra. The anger and self-pity that had consumed him in prison began to recede, replaced by a quiet introspection. He saw the direct impact of his labor: a cleared trail, a safer hillside, a community protected. It was a different kind of justice than he had ever pursued, a tangible, immediate contribution. One afternoon, while clearing a firebreak, Marcus found himself working alongside Hector. "You're doing good, Thorne," Hector said, his voice gruff, but with a hint of approval. "You're learning." "It's different," Marcus admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Everything is different." "That's the point," Hector replied, leaning on his shovel. "Out here, you can't lie to the fire. You can't bluff the mountain. And you can't lie to yourself for long. It's just you, the work, and the truth." Marcus looked at the vast, silent forest, then at his grimy, blistered hands. Hector's words resonated deeply. In the inferno, and in the quiet, meditative work of conservation, Marcus Thorne was slowly, painfully, being stripped of his old self, and in the ashes, a new, more humble identity is beginning to form. He was learning to be a part of something larger than himself, to contribute, not to conquer, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt a genuine, albeit painful, sense of purpose. Chapter 6. The Weight of the Axe. Life in the conservation camp settled into a grueling rhythm. Marcus, now officially part of Deadwood 7, found that the physical demands of firefighting and conservation work were relentless, but oddly, they provided a structure that his former life had lacked. His body, once a mere vessel for his intellect and indulgences, was now a tool, honed by endless runs, the swing of a Pulaski, and the sheer endurance required to clear brush under the unforgiving California sun. The aches and pains were constant, but they were honest pains, a stark contrast to the gnawing, existential emptiness he had carried in Los Angeles. The camaraderie among the crew was a revelation. These men, from backgrounds Marcus would never have encountered in his insulated world, were united by shared hardship and a common purpose. There were no grand titles, no corner offices, just the raw, unvarnished truth of survival and teamwork. He learned to trust Carlos, the young inmate he'd instinctively pulled from the flames during their first fire, who now watched his back with quiet loyalty. He learned to respect Miller, the CALFIRE instructor, whose gruff exterior hid a deep commitment to safety and a surprising, albeit tough, mentorship. And then there was Hector. The older inmate from CMC had transferred to Deadwood a few weeks after Marcus, a quiet observer who seemed to understand Marcus's internal battles without a word. Hector, a former carpenter serving time for a nonviolent drug offense, had a grounded wisdom that Marcus, for all his intellectual prowess, had never encountered. He moved with a deliberate grace, his hands scarred but capable, and his eyes held a depth that suggested a lifetime of lessons learned the hard way. One sweltering afternoon, during a break from clearing a particularly stubborn section of chaparral, Marcus found himself sitting next to Hector. The air shimmered with heat, and the scent of dry earth and distant smoke hung heavy. "You're still fighting yourself, Thorne," Hector observed, his voice a low rumble, not a judgment. "I see it in your eyes. You think this work is just a penance, a way to get out faster." Marcus bristled, his old defensiveness flaring. "It is a way to get out faster, and I'm doing the work, aren't I?" "You're doing the work," Hector conceded, taking a long swig from his water bottle. "But are you being the work? This ain't just about credits, son. It's about what you take with you when you leave, or what you leave behind." Hector's words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He was still fighting himself. He was still Marcus Thorne, the strategist, calculating the angles, manipulating the system, even this system. He was performing, not transforming. The thought was a bitter realization. That evening, back in the camp, Marcus found himself drawn to the rehabilitative programs offered. Previously, he'd viewed them as mere credit-earning opportunities, boxes to tick on his path to early release. Now, Hector's words echoed in his mind. He walked into the small, stuffy room where an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting was underway. He'd always dismissed AA as a weakness, a public confession of failure. But as he listened to the raw, honest confessions of men who had lost everything to addiction, he saw a mirror reflecting his own desperate need for control, his own reliance on external stimuli to numb an inner void. His hard partying wasn't just a lifestyle, it was a symptom. He started attending regularly, sitting in the back, listening. He didn't speak at first, his lawyer's instinct to analyze and dissect overriding any urge to share. But slowly, imperceptibly, the stories began to chip away at his defenses. He saw the genuine remorse, the struggle for self-awareness, the desperate hope for a different path. He began to see that his own addiction wasn't to alcohol or drugs, but to winning, to power, to the illusion of perfection. He also enrolled in anger management classes, another program he'd once scoffed at. He realized his quick temper, his cutting remarks, and his need to dominate had been tools, but also chains. He learned about triggers, about healthy coping mechanisms, about the corrosive nature of unaddressed rage. He began to understand that his anger wasn't a strength, but a weakness, a reaction to his own insecurities. As Marcus engaged in these programs, a new kind of internal conflict began. The Marcus Thorne who had filed the false document, the man driven by ego and a win-at-all-costs mentality, was locked in a silent battle with the Marcus Thorne who was now sweating alongside other inmates, learning humility and confronting his own moral failings. He would have moments of profound clarity, followed by waves of his old cynicism, the ingrained patterns of a lifetime. This internal struggle manifested in his interactions. He found himself less inclined to argue, more willing to listen. But his past still cast a long shadow. One day, a new inmate arrived, a hulking man named Silas, serving time for aggravated assault. Silas had a reputation from other facilities as a manipulator, a bully who preyed on perceived weakness. He quickly identified Marcus as a former suit, a man who had fallen from grace and saw an opportunity. "Heard you were a big-shot lawyer, Thorne," Silas sneered during mealtime, his voice carrying across the noisy dining hall. "Must be tough, huh? Eating slop with the rest of us." Marcus ignored him, focusing on his tray. He felt the familiar prickle of anger, the urge to lash out, to cut Silas down with a sharp retort. But he remembered his anger management lessons, the need to choose his battles. Silas persisted. He started making subtle threats, demanding Marcus's dessert, trying to provoke a reaction. He spread rumors about Marcus's crime, twisting the details, painting him as a sniveling coward who had betrayed his own kind. "You filed false papers, didn't you, lawyer?" Silas taunted one afternoon in the yard, blocking Marcus's path. "Stole from your own client, probably. Not much of a man, are you?" The accusation, though partially true in its essence, was a distortion. Marcus had never stolen from his client. He had defrauded the court to benefit his client, but the nuance was lost in Silas's crude interpretation. The old Marcus would have erupted, would have verbally eviscerated Silas. The new Marcus, however, felt a different kind of pain, the sting of public judgment, the weight of his past. "My crime is my own," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, meeting Silas's gaze. "It has nothing to do with you." Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, it has everything to do with me. You think you're better than us? You're just another con, Thorne, and you owe me." Silas began demanding favors, Marcus's extra rations, his clean laundry, even trying to coerce him into writing letters for other inmates, subtly hinting at illegal activities. Marcus refused, politely but firmly. He knew this was a test, not just from Silas, but from himself. Would he revert to his old ways, using his intellect to manipulate, or would he stand firm on his newfound principles? The tension escalated. Silas became more aggressive, his threats more explicit. Marcus knew he couldn't avoid a confrontation forever. He could fight, but he was physically outmatched. He could complain to the guards, but that would mark him as a snitch, making his life even harder. He sought out Hector. "Silas is pushing," Marcus said, his voice tight. "He wants me to break." Hector listened, his eyes thoughtful. "You got two choices, Thorn. You can go back to being who you were, or you can stand for who you're becoming. The Fire don't care about your past, only what you bring to the line, and neither do we." Hector's words resonated. Marcus realized that this wasn't just about Silas. It was about his own integrity. He had to defend his newfound self. He couldn't go back to being the man who bent the rules, who sought the easy way out. The next day, Silas cornered Marcus in the laundry room, his face contorted with menace. "Last chance, lawyer. You give me what I want, or you're going to regret it." Marcus looked at Silas, not with fear, but with a quiet resolve. He thought of the roaring flames, the shared burden of the Pulaski, the lessons of humility and teamwork he'd learned. He thought of Hector's unwavering gaze. "No," Marcus said, his voice clear and firm. "I won't. I'm done with that life. You want to make trouble? You'll have to go through me." Silas lunged, but Marcus surprisingly was ready. The rigorous PFT had sharpened his reflexes. He dodged the first blow, then the second. He wasn't a fighter, but he had learned to move, to anticipate. He didn't throw a punch, but he held his ground, his stance solid. The commotion drew the attention of a passing guard, who quickly intervened, separating the two men. Silas was disciplined, and the incident, though minor, sent a clear message. Marcus Thorn wasn't the easy mark Silas had assumed. He had stood his ground, not with violence, but with a quiet strength born of self-respect. The confrontation, though terrifying, was a crucible. It solidified his transformation, proving to himself and to the others that the man who had filed the false document was indeed being consumed by the ashes, and a new, more principled individual was emerging from the inferno. The weight of the axe, once a burden, was now a tool for building, not destroying. Chapter 7. Forged by Fire and Brotherhood. Months blurred into a cycle of sweat, smoke, and self-reflection. Marcus Thorn, the former legal shark, was now simply Thorn, a reliable hand on Deadwood 7. His once soft lawyer's hands were now calloused and scarred, strong from wielding a Pulaski and hauling heavy hoses. His body, lean and hardened, moved with a newfound efficiency. He had not only adapted to the rigors of fire camp life, but had begun to excel. He was no longer just going through the motions to earn credits. The work itself had become a form of meditation, a tangible expression of purpose, clearing brush, digging fire lines, maintaining trails. Each task, however mundane, contributed to something larger than himself. He found a quiet satisfaction in the physical exhaustion, a purity in the effort that his high-stakes legal victories had never provided. His engagement in the rehabilitative programs deepened. In the AA meetings, he finally spoke, not just about his crime, but about the underlying emptiness, the desperate need for control that had driven him. He talked about his hard partying past, not with a hint of bravado, but with a raw honesty that resonated with the other men. He admitted his addiction to winning, to external validation, and the profound fear of failure that had led him to commit fraud. Sharing his story, stripped of all legal jargon and pretense, was a terrifying but liberating experience. He found a strange kind of kinship with men whose lives were so different, yet whose struggles with their own demons mirrored his own. In the anger management classes, he learned to identify the triggers that sent him spiraling into rage or defensiveness. He practiced breathing techniques, learned to pause before reacting, to choose his response rather than simply reacting. The confrontation with Silas had been a turning point, a moment where he chose principle over pride, and the lessons from these classes had given him the tools to do so. He still felt the prickle of his old temper, but now he had the awareness to rein it in, to channel that energy into productive action rather than destructive outbursts. Marcus also took advantage of the correspondence courses offered, particularly those related to fire science and emergency management. His intellect, once a weapon, was now a tool for learning and growth. He devoured textbooks, applying his sharp mind to understanding complex fire behavior models and logistical challenges. He even tutored some of the younger inmates, including Carlos, who struggled with the academic material. The act of teaching, of patiently explaining concepts, was another step in shedding his old arrogance. The credits accumulated steadily. His 2-for-1 credits from active fire crew participation were the primary driver, significantly chipping away at his sentence. Each week on the line, each successful fire suppression, each conservation project translated into tangible time off his sentence. The additional credits from his program participation, milestone completion credits for AA and anger management, and educational merit credits for his correspondence courses, further accelerated his release date. He saw the numbers shrinking, the end of his incarceration no longer a distant dream, but a looming reality. His bond with Hector deepened into a quiet, profound mentorship. Hector saw through Marcus's remaining vestiges of pride, pushing him to confront uncomfortable truths. "You can't just put on a new uniform, Thorne," Hector had said one evening, as they sat on a bench outside the dorm, watching the stars. "You got to change the man inside it. The fire, it burns away the dead wood. But it's up to you to grow something new in its place." Carlos, once a timid young man, had flourished under Marcus's informal tutelage and the rigorous demands of the camp. He looked up to Marcus, not as a former lawyer, but as a reliable crewmate, a mentor who had helped him understand fire behavior and even some basic math. Their shared experiences on the fire line had forged a bond stronger than any social divide. Then came the call that would test everything. A massive, fast-moving wildfire, the Juniper Ridge Fire, had erupted in a remote, mountainous region. It was spreading rapidly, threatening a small, isolated community and a critical wildlife preserve. Deadwood 7 was among the first crews deployed, air thick with a sense of urgency. The Juniper Ridge Fire was unlike anything Marcus had experienced. The flames were immense, crowning through the treetops, driven by erratic winds. The terrain was steep, treacherous, and choked with dry fuel. The air was a suffocating mix of smoke and ash, making breathing a constant struggle. Their mission was critical: establish a fire line on a steep, unstable slope above a cluster of homes, preventing the fire from cresting the ridge and incinerating the community below. It was a brutal, exhausting task. The heat was unbearable, the smoke blinding. Marcus worked tirelessly, swinging his Pulaski with a practiced rhythm, digging deep, clearing every last scrap of fuel. Suddenly, a roar echoed through the canyon. A massive tree, weakened by the heat, began to fall directly towards Carlos, who was working a few yards ahead, focused on his section of the line. Time seemed to slow. Marcus saw it first, his mind, sharpened by months of training and a newfound awareness, instantly assessing the danger. "Carlos!" Tree exclamation mark. Marcus screamed, his voice raw, throwing his body forward, tackling Carlos to the ground just as the massive trunk crashed down, pulverizing the spot where Carlos had been standing moments before. The impact sent a shockwave through them. Carlos lay gasping, his face pale with terror, but unharmed. Marcus, bruised and shaken, helped him up. Miller, the CALFIRE instructor, rushed over, his face grim. "Thorne! Carlos, you all right?" "We're good, Miller," Marcus coughed, his throat raw. "Just a close call." Miller clapped him hard on the shoulder, his eyes holding a rare, profound respect. "Good call, Thorne. You saved his life." The incident, though terrifying, solidified something profound within Marcus. It wasn't about winning a case or saving his reputation. It was about saving a life. It was about the instinct to protect, to serve, born not of obligation, but of genuine care. In that moment, the old Marcus Thorne, the calculating, self-serving lawyer, was finally and irrevocably consumed by the flames, leaving behind a man who understood the true weight of responsibility, the true meaning of brotherhood. The Juniper Ridge fire raged for days, but Deadwood 7, along with other crews, held the line. They emerged, exhausted and soot-stained, but victorious. Back at camp, the atmosphere was one of quiet triumph. Marcus was hailed as a hero, not just by Carlos, but by the entire crew, and even by Miller. In the weeks that followed, as the fire season began to wane, Marcus felt a new kind of anticipation. His sentence was almost complete. The credits, accumulated through sweat, sacrifice, and genuine transformation, had done their work. He had arrived in fire camp broken and arrogant, seeking only a faster way out. He was leaving forged by fire, humbled by hardship, and with a profound understanding of what it meant to be truly useful, truly connected. One evening, Hector sat beside him on the bench, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. "You're ready, Thorne," Hector said, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "You found your fire, didn't you?" Marcus nodded, looking at his scarred hands, then out at the vast, silent forest. "I did, Hector, and it burned away everything I thought I was." His release date was set. The journey had been arduous, painful, and transformative. He was no longer just counting the days, he was ready for them. Ready for the next chapter, whatever it might bring. He had faced the inferno and emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably changed. Chapter 8. The Ghost of Former Lives. The morning of his release dawned crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the fire season. Marcus stood in the small processing room at Deadwood Conservation Camp, dressed in the ill-fitting, donated clothes provided by the state, a pair of faded jeans, a plain t-shirt, and a worn jacket. His personal belongings, a meager collection of letters, and a few worn books, were in a small duffel bag at his feet. His once expensive watch, his rings, his meticulously tailored suits, all gone, symbols of a life that felt impossibly distant. Hector was there, a silent, comforting presence. He clapped Marcus on the shoulder, his eyes conveying more than words. "Go on, Thorne. Don't look back. Just keep moving forward." Carlos, looking younger and more hopeful than Marcus remembered, gripped his hand. "Thank you, Marcus, for everything." Marcus nodded, a lump in his throat. He had come to Deadwood seeking a faster exit, but he was leaving with something far more valuable, a sense of purpose, a connection to these men forged in the crucible of shared hardship. He was no longer just Marcus Thorne, the disgraced lawyer. He was Thorne, a fire crewmate, a mentor, a man who had faced the inferno and found a different kind of strength. The gate clanged open, a sound that should have been liberating but felt strangely anticlimactic. A plain white sedan waited, driven by a parole officer with a weary face. Marcus took a deep breath, the scent of pine and damp earth filling his lungs, a smell he knew he would forever associate with his redemption. He stepped out, leaving the familiar confines of the camp behind, and into a world that felt both exhilaratingly free and terrifyingly alien. The initial hours were a blur of bureaucratic necessities. The parole office in Los Angeles was a stark reminder of the system that still held him. He was given a list of conditions: regular check-ins, residing within designated county limits, submitting to warrantless searches. His parole officer, a young woman named Ms. Chen, looked at him with a mixture of professional detachment and a hint of curiosity. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice flat, "you're a high-profile case. Don't make waves. Just do your time on parole and stay out of trouble." He nodded, the words feeling like a leash. He was free, but not truly free. His first destination was a halfway house in a nondescript part of the city, a stark contrast to his former penthouse. It was clean, functional, but impersonal. He was assigned a small room, a bed, a dresser. No panoramic views, no expensive art. He unpacked his meager belongings, the silence of the room amplifying the sudden, overwhelming sense of loneliness. The city itself was a sensory overload. The roar of traffic, the endless stream of faces, the dazzling array of advertisements. It was all too much, too fast. He had spent months in the quiet, structured environment of the camp, where every sound had meaning, every interaction was deliberate. Now, he felt adrift in a sea of indifference. People hurried past, absorbed in their own lives, oblivious to the former titan of the legal world walking among them. He was a ghost in his own city. His first few attempts at re-entry were met with a chilling societal skepticism. He tried to contact former colleagues, not for work, but just to reconnect. His calls went unanswered. Emails bounced back. The few who did respond were polite but distant, their voices laced with an unspoken discomfort. "Marcus, it's good to hear from you, but I'm really swamped right now." The message was clear. He was tainted. The legal community, once his family, had excommunicated him. He understood. His crime, filing a false document, struck at the very core of legal integrity. His disbarment was a public declaration of his unfitness. The moral turpitude attached to his conviction was a brand he couldn't hide. He was a pariah. The job search was a brutal exercise in humility. He started with the basics, applying for entry-level positions, anything to get his foot in the door. He tried to leverage his fire camp experience, highlighting his CALFIRE certification, his leadership skills, his newfound work ethic. He even considered applying for a position with CALFIRE, remembering the documents mentioned that a felony conviction didn't disqualify employment. But his past, his other past, always loomed. "Thank you for your application, Mr. Thorne," a polite HR manager said over the phone after an interview for a data entry position. "Your resume is certainly unique, but we found someone whose background was a better fit." He knew what better fit meant. It meant no felony conviction. It meant not a disbarred lawyer. He filled out countless applications, his fingers, once adept at drafting complex legal briefs, now fumbling with online forms. Each time, he had to check the box. "Have you ever been convicted of a felony?" Each time, he felt a fresh wave of shame. He was legally obligated to disclose it for professional licensing. And while ban the box legislation prohibited private employers from considering dismissed cases in hiring, his conviction wasn't yet dismissed, and the stigma was palpable. He tried to explain his transformation, his time in fire camp, the lessons he'd learned, but the words felt hollow, inadequate against the weight of his criminal record. People saw the headline, not the man. They saw the fraud, not the firefighter. One afternoon, while picking up groceries at a local market, Marcus saw him, Julian Vance, his former client's ex-husband, the tech titan whose hidden assets had been the catalyst for Marcus's downfall. Julian looked prosperous, unburdened, strolling through the produce aisle with a woman half his age. Their eyes met across a display of organic kale. Julian's face, initially blank, contorted into a sneer of recognition. He said nothing, but his contempt was a palpable force, a silent accusation. Marcus felt a cold knot in his stomach, the ghost of his former life mocking him. He quickly turned away, abandoning his cart, and walked out of the store, the mundane act of grocery shopping suddenly unbearable. The loneliness was profound. He had no friends, no family who would speak to him. His hard-partying associates had vanished like smoke. He spent his evenings in the small sterile room at the halfway house, the silence amplifying the echoes of his past. He missed the camaraderie of the fire camp, the shared purpose, even the gruff familiarity of Miller and Hector. He missed the physical exhaustion that had dulled the incessant hum of his anxieties. Now, the hum was back, louder than ever. He tried to find solace in the routines he'd learned in camp. He woke early, exercised, tried to maintain a structured day. He read, not legal texts, but books on philosophy, on ethics, on redemption. He found himself drawn to stories of resilience, of second chances. He started a journal, pouring out his thoughts, his regrets, his struggles. The internal battle was far from over. The old Marcus, the arrogant, calculating strategist, still whispered in his ear, urging him to find a shortcut, a way to regain his former glory. But the new Marcus, forged in fire and humility, fought back, reminding him of the lessons learned, the values he had rediscovered. He knew that true redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about confronting it, accepting it, and building something new from its ashes. He looked at his hands, still calloused, still scarred. They were no longer the hands of a lawyer, but they were the hands of a man who had worked, who had served, who had saved a life. The path ahead was unclear, fraught with challenges. But for the first time, Marcus Thorne wasn't just looking for an exit. He was looking for a way to live. Chapter 9. The scarred record weeks bled into months at the halfway house. Marcus settled into a precarious new routine, a constant battle against the crushing loneliness and the insidious whispers of his past. He continued his physical regimen, running the city streets, a stark contrast to the wild trails of Deadwood. He attended AA meetings, his voice growing stronger, his admissions more profound. He even found a small part-time job stocking shelves at a local grocery store, a far cry from the opulent offices he once commanded, but it paid the bills and provided a structured day. Yet, the grocery store job, while providing a meager income, felt like a dead end. His hands, though strong, were still stained by the unseen ink of his conviction. Every time he filled out a form, every time a background check was mentioned, he felt the familiar surge of dread. He wanted to build something new, something honest, but the specter of his felony conviction, Penal Code 115, loomed over every opportunity. He remembered the legal jargon from the rehabilitative programs at camp, the snippets about post-conviction relief and expungements. He knew intimately the weight of a criminal record, not just from his own experience, but from the stories of countless men in prison. He craved not absolution, but validation, not a return to his old life, but a chance at a new one, unburdened by the constant shame of his past. One cold, rainy evening, huddled in his small halfway house room, Marcus pulled out a tattered legal pad and a cheap pen. He began to research. He couldn't access Westlaw or LexisNexis, the sophisticated legal databases he once commanded. Instead, he relied on the public library's computers, navigating clunky government websites and obscure legal aid forums. It was a humbling experience, stripping away the luxury of professional tools, forcing him to rely on the raw grit of research he hadn't experienced since law school. He focused on California Penal Code 1203.4b dismissal. He remembered the brief mentions in camp, the hopeful whispers among inmates. He meticulously studied the statutes, cross-referencing definitions, piecing together the requirements. He learned that PC 1203.4b applied to cases where a defendant had successfully completed probation, or in his case, parole, as he was released from state prison under AB 2147. The process was complex, riddled with specific deadlines and arcane procedural rules. He drafted a petition for dismissal, his legal mind, though dulled by disuse, beginning to hum with a familiar, if rusty, efficiency. He cited relevant case law, meticulously detailed his incarceration, his time in fire camp, his completion of rehabilitative programs, and his exemplary conduct since release. He included letters of support from Miller, his former KL fire instructor, and even a surprisingly heartfelt note from Hector, mailed to him through a secure channel. The first hurdle was the district attorney's office. He knew Eleanor Vance would likely oppose it. The prosecutor had made her reputation by putting him behind bars. He drafted a compelling argument for his rehabilitation, emphasizing not just his punishment, but his active transformation. He highlighted the societal benefit of his fire camp service, the hundreds of hours he'd spent battling wildfires, protecting communities. He filed the petition in the Superior Court, the familiar court clerk's office now seeming like a foreign country. He felt the weight of countless eyes as he approached the counter, the faint whispers that might be his name or just his paranoia. He was no longer the confident attorney, but a petitioner, a man seeking mercy from the very system he had defrauded. The waiting was the hardest part. Days stretched into weeks. He went to work, stocked shelves, pretended to be an ordinary citizen, but his mind was consumed by the pending motion, the hope and fear swirling within him. He practiced what he would say if he had to appear in court, rehearsing his arguments, his tone, his humility. He wouldn't be the arrogant Marcus Thorne this time. Then came the notice. A hearing was scheduled. The courtroom was smaller than the grand chambers he was used to. His former defense attorneys were absent. He represented himself, a stark reversal of roles. Eleanor Vance was there, her expression unreadable. He stood before the judge, his hands, calloused from fire camp, resting on the wooden railing of the defendant's stand. He spoke, not with the soaring rhetoric of a trial lawyer, but with the quiet, earnest voice of a man who had faced his demons. He recounted his journey, from the arrogance that led to his crime, to the brutal realities of prison, the transformative power of fire camp, and his commitment to living an honest, purposeful life. He acknowledged the gravity of his offense, expressed sincere remorse, and explained his understanding that this dismissal was not an erasure, but a recognition of his rehabilitation. Eleanor Vance, surprisingly, offered only a minimal objection. "Your Honor," she said, her voice flat, "while the defendant's crime was serious and involved moral turpitude, the people acknowledge his completion of his sentence, his participation in the conservation camp program, and his efforts towards rehabilitation. We submit the matter to the court's discretion." Marcus felt a surge of disbelief. It wasn't an endorsement, but it wasn't the fierce opposition he had anticipated. Perhaps even she saw the change in him. The judge, a different one from his sentencing, listened intently. She asked a few pointed questions about his time in camp, about his plans for the future. Marcus answered honestly, without embellishment. "Mr. Thorne," the judge finally said, her voice measured, "the court recognizes the efforts you have made toward rehabilitation. Your participation in the conservation camp program, particularly in the capacity of a firefighter, demonstrates a commitment to public service and a willingness to confront the consequences of your actions." A knot formed in Marcus's throat. He held his breath. "Therefore," she continued, "pursuant to Penal Code 1203.4b, your petition for dismissal is granted. Your conviction for PC-115 is hereby dismissed." A wave of emotion washed over Marcus. Relief, profound and overwhelming, mixed with a bittersweet ache. It was a victory, but a quiet one, a partial one. He understood the nuance of PC-1203.4b perfectly. It was a dismissal, not a true expungement. His rap sheet would still show the conviction, but with a notation that it had been dismissed. It meant he no longer had to disclose it to most private employers, but it would still appear on background checks for government jobs, professional licenses, and certain other inquiries. And critically, for a lawyer, it meant the state bar would still see the conviction, and he would still have to disclose it fully in any attempt at reinstatement. The dismissal was a profound psychological step. It allowed him to truthfully say, in many contexts, that he had not been convicted of a felony. It offered a degree of freedom, a chance to shed some of the shame. But it didn't erase the past. It simply added a footnote. His record was scarred, not cleansed. As he walked out of the courthouse, the setting sun cast long shadows. He felt lighter, a weight lifted from his shoulders. He hadn't fought fire in the legal sense, but he had fought for this, with integrity and humility. It was a personal victory, a testament to his transformation. But the battle for full professional reinstatement, the ultimate test of his redemption, still lay ahead. And for that, he knew, the scarred record would be examined with even greater scrutiny. Chapter 10. Before the Gatekeepers. The dismissal of his felony conviction, while a profound personal victory, was merely a legal footnote in the eyes of the California State Bar. Marcus knew this. The scarred record was still visible to them, and his duty to disclose it was absolute. His ultimate goal, to reclaim his license, to practice law again, was a mountain still to be climbed, and the ascent promised to be far more arduous than any firebreak he had ever dug. He spent weeks preparing, his small room at the halfway house transformed into a war room. He meticulously gathered every document, his certificate of completion from Deadwood, the letters of support from Miller and Hector, his AA meeting attendance records, certificates from his anger management and fire science courses, even his grocery store pay stubs as proof of legitimate employment. He drafted his petition for reinstatement as an attorney of the State Bar of California, a document that felt both deeply personal and overwhelmingly formal. The most challenging part was the disclosure statement supporting petition for reinstatement. He had to lay bare his entire past, not just the PC 115 conviction, but the hard partying lifestyle, the arrogance, the desperate need to win that had led him to commit fraud. He had to demonstrate candor, a quality he had once manipulated, but now understood as fundamental to integrity. He wrote about the emptiness he had tried to fill, the moral compromises he had made, and the profound transformation he had undergone in the crucible of fire camp. He didn't shy away from the shame, but presented it as a catalyst for genuine change. He knew the State Bar would impose an exceptionally heavy burden of proving rehabilitation. He had to demonstrate, by the most clear and convincing evidence, that he possessed stronger proof of present honesty and integrity than someone seeking admission for the first time. This wasn't about legal loopholes. It was about a fundamental shift in character. His parole officer, Ms. Chen, while initially skeptical, had observed his consistent progress. She wrote a concise professional letter confirming his compliance with parole conditions and his active participation in rehabilitative programs. It was a small but significant endorsement. The petition was filed, and the waiting began again. This time, the stakes felt even higher. This wasn't just about his freedom. It was about his identity, his purpose, his very soul. He continued his routines, stocking shelves, running, attending meetings, trying to channel his anxiety into productive energy. Then came the summons for the moral character interview. It would be held before a 3-member panel of the State Bar Court, a tribunal whose power over his future felt absolute. The day of the interview dawned clear and cold. Marcus dressed in his best, albeit ill-fitting suit, alone from a surprisingly sympathetic former colleague who had heard of his efforts. He arrived at the State Bar Court building, a nondescript office building that held immense power over the lives of California attorneys. The sterile hallways, the hushed whispers, the air of solemnity. It was a world he had once navigated with ease, now fraught with a terrifying vulnerability. He was ushered into a small, austere hearing room. 3 individuals sat at a long, polished table. Presiding was Judge Eleanor Vance, the very prosecutor who had put him in prison. Her presence was a shock, a cruel twist of fate. He hadn't anticipated her involvement in the state bar court. Beside her sat a stern-faced woman with tightly pulled-back hair and a kindly-looking older gentleman. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Vance began, her voice as clipped and precise as he remembered, "we have reviewed your petition for reinstatement. This hearing is to assess your present moral qualifications and your rehabilitation." Her gaze was unwavering, analytical, giving nothing away. He began by acknowledging his crime, not as a mistake, but as a deliberate act of fraud. "Your Honor, members of the panel," he started, his voice steady, "I stand before you today, not as the man who filed that false document, but as a man who has spent the last 2 years confronting the profound moral failings that led to that act." He recounted his journey, not with legalistic arguments, but with raw, personal narrative. He spoke of the shock of incarceration, the dehumanizing process, the despair. He described his time in fire camp, the physical crucible, the lessons of humility and teamwork. He spoke of the Juniper Ridge fire, the falling tree, and the moment he saved Carlos's life, not as an act of heroism, but as a profound shift in his understanding of responsibility. "In fire camp," Marcus explained, his voice gaining a quiet passion, "I learned that there's no bluffing a wildfire, there's no manipulating the terrain. The consequences are immediate and absolute. It was a stark contrast to the world I had inhabited, where I believed I could always control the narrative, always find a loophole. The fire stripped away my arrogance, my need for control, and forced me to confront the truth of who I was." He spoke about his participation in AA and anger management, detailing the painful process of self-reflection, of admitting his vulnerabilities. He didn't shy away from his hard partying past, but presented it as a symptom of a deeper emptiness, a desperate attempt to outrun his own insecurities. "I used to believe that success was measured by what I acquired," he confessed. "By the cases I won, the money I made, the image I projected. In prison, I learned that true success is measured by what you give back, by the integrity you maintain, even when no one is watching." The stern-faced woman on the panel, Ms. Albright, interrupted. "Mr. Thorne, your petition details a significant transformation. However, a crime involving moral turpitude, particularly by an officer of the court, is viewed with extreme gravity. How can we be certain this is not merely a performance, a strategic maneuver to regain your license?" Marcus met her gaze directly. "Ms. Albright, I understand your skepticism. I would be skeptical too. There is no guarantee, no magic switch that flips, but I can tell you this. The man who filed that document would never have survived fire camp. He would have broken. The man who stands before you today has faced death, has served his time, and has chosen, every single day since, to live by a different code. My rehabilitation is not a performance. It is a profound, ongoing commitment. It is the hardest work I have ever done, far harder than any legal case." He then presented his letters of support. Miller's terse, powerful endorsement of his work ethic and selflessness on the fire line. Hector's handwritten note, simple but profound, testifying to Marcus's genuine change of heart. He even mentioned his grocery store job, not as a point of pride, but as proof of his commitment to honest labor. Judge Vance, surprisingly, remained silent throughout much of his testimony, her expression unreadable. But as Marcus concluded, she leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it, "your petition also mentions your penal code 1203.4b dismissal. While we acknowledge it, you understand that it does not erase the conviction for the purposes of this board. You still have a felony on your record." "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus affirmed. "I understand completely. I disclosed it fully, as required. The dismissal is not an erasure. It is a judicial recognition of my rehabilitation. It is proof that the conditions of my parole were fulfilled, and that I have taken significant steps to address my past. It is a testament to the fact that I am no longer the man who committed that crime." He then spoke about his plans, not to return to high-stakes divorce law, but to focus on post-conviction relief, on helping others navigate the complex legal system, particularly those who had served their time and were seeking a second chance. He wanted to use his experience, his unique perspective, to advocate for a different kind of justice. The hearing concluded. Marcus walked out, the weight of his words, his truth, hanging in the air. He had laid himself bare, confessed his sins, and presented the evidence of his transformation. Now, it was up to the gatekeepers. He had done all he could. The ultimate test of his redemption lay in their hands. The waiting, he knew, would be agonizing. Chapter 11. The New Oath. The days following the state bar hearing stretched into an agonizing eternity. Marcus returned to his routine at the grocery store, stocking shelves, bagging groceries, his mind a constant loop of his testimony, Judge Vance's unreadable expression, and Ms. Albright's piercing questions. Every phone call, every piece of mail, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He tried to temper his expectations, reminding himself of the heavy burden of proof and the inherent skepticism of the board when dealing with a disbarred attorney, especially one with a felony conviction for moral turpitude. He found solace in his runs, pushing his body to the limits, the physical exertion a welcome distraction from the mental torment. He continued attending his AA meetings, finding strength in the shared vulnerability of the group. He even started volunteering at a local legal aid clinic, not as a lawyer, but as a paralegal, assisting with intake forms and basic research for indigent clients. It was a small way to reconnect with the law, to feel useful, to contribute. He found a quiet satisfaction in helping people navigate the system, a stark contrast to his past focus on winning at all costs. Then, one Tuesday morning, a thick envelope arrived from the State Bar of California. His hands trembled as he tore it open. He braced himself for the worst, for the final, definitive rejection. He scanned the first few paragraphs, his eyes darting across the legalese. His breath hitched. The decision was not a simple yes or no. It was a nuanced ruling, a testament to the complexity of his case and the board's careful deliberation. The letter stated that the panel, after careful consideration of his petition, his testimony, and the supporting evidence, had found clear and convincing evidence of his rehabilitation. They acknowledged the profound transformation he had undergone, citing his exemplary conduct in the conservation camp program, his active participation in rehabilitative programs, and his sustained commitment to honest living since his release. The letters from Miller and Hector, along with Ms. Chen's parole report, were noted as highly persuasive. However, given the gravity of his original offense, a felony involving moral turpitude committed by an officer of the court, the reinstatement was not unconditional. Marcus Thorne was to be reinstated to the State Bar of California, but with a period of 5 years of probation, subject to specific conditions. The conditions included 1. Strict adherence to all ethical rules and professional conduct standards. 2. Regular reporting to a designated state bar probation monitor. 3. Mandatory participation in an ethics and professional responsibility mentorship program with an attorney approved by the state bar. 4th, completion of an additional 50 hours of pro bono legal service annually for the duration of his probation, specifically in areas related to criminal justice reform or post-conviction relief. 5. Continued attendance at AA meetings and submission of verification. 6. No handling of client funds or trust accounts for the first 3 years of his probation. Reading the conditions, Marcus felt a surge of emotions. Relief, overwhelming and profound, that he had been granted this second chance. Humility, knowing the road ahead would still be challenging. And a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the board's decision, but for the arduous journey that had led him to this point. He had faced the gatekeepers, laid bare his soul, and they had seen enough of the new Marcus to grant him passage. He immediately called Ms. Chen, his parole officer, who expressed a rare, genuine congratulations. He then called Hector, reaching him through a mutual contact. Hector's gruff voice, filled with pride, was the sweetest sound Marcus had heard in years. "Told you, Thorne," Hector chuckled. "The fire don't lie." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. He found a small, modest office space in a less glamorous part of downtown, far from the gleaming towers of Century City. He didn't hang a shingle that screamed Thorne and Associates. Instead, a simple, understated plaque read, "Marcus Thorne, Attorney at Law." He knew he couldn't and wouldn't return to the high-stakes divorce cases that had defined his past. His experience in fire camp, his journey through the criminal justice system, and his newfound empathy had irrevocably changed his perspective. He wanted to help those who truly needed it, those who had been discarded by society, those who were seeking their own second chances. His first client was a young man named David, a former inmate from another camp, struggling to get a construction job due to a minor, non-violent felony conviction from years ago. David's case was exactly what Marcus had envisioned, navigating the complexities of post-conviction relief, helping someone clear their record, giving them a legitimate path forward. Marcus approached David's case with a meticulousness he hadn't applied since his earliest, most idealistic days in law school. He wasn't driven by billable hours or the thrill of a public victory. He was driven by a quiet determination to make a tangible difference, to use his hard-won knowledge to help someone avoid the pitfalls he had experienced. He spent hours researching, drafting motions, and speaking with David, not just as a client, but as a fellow traveler on the path to redemption. His pro bono work became a cornerstone of his practice. He joined an organization dedicated to helping formerly incarcerated individuals navigate the legal system, assisting with expungements, parole issues, and employment barriers. He found himself in community centers, speaking to groups of men and women recently released from prison, sharing his own story, offering hope and practical advice. He often spoke about the fire camp, about the discipline, the camaraderie, and the transformative power of honest labor. He emphasized that redemption wasn't a destination, but a continuous journey. His mentorship program, mandated by the state bar, paired him with a retired public defender named Clara Rodriguez. Clara was sharp, compassionate, and had seen it all. She challenged his legal reasoning, pushed him to consider every ethical angle, and offered a steady hand of guidance. She became a sounding board, a confidant, and a constant reminder of the high standards he now had to uphold. The conditions of his probation were stringent, but Marcus embraced them. Each report to his probation monitor was an opportunity to reflect on his progress. Each hour of pro bono work was a reminder of his commitment. He found a profound satisfaction in the quiet victories: a dismissed conviction for a deserving client, a successful parole hearing, a family reunited. These were not the splashy headlines of his past, but they were deeply meaningful, fulfilling a purpose far greater than personal gain. He learned to live modestly, without the trappings of his former wealth. The penthouse, the luxury cars, the designer suits, they were ghosts of a life he no longer desired. He found joy in simple things: a good cup of coffee, a long run, a quiet evening reading a book, the genuine gratitude in a client's eyes. One afternoon, a few months into his new practice, Marcus received a call. It was Cassandra Vance, his former client, the woman whose divorce case had been the catalyst for his downfall. He felt a pang of anxiety, wondering if she had heard about his reinstatement, if she was calling to condemn him. "Marcus?" Her voice was hesitant. I heard you're practicing again." "Yes, Cassandra," he replied, his voice calm. "I am." "I just wanted to say," she continued, her voice softer now, "thank you for everything. Even if it was complicated. You got me out, and I heard what you went through. I hope you find what you're looking for." The call was brief, but it left Marcus with a profound sense of peace. It wasn't an apology or a full reconciliation, but it was a recognition, a quiet acknowledgement from a past he had once tried to bury. Marcus Thorne was no longer the apex predator of the legal world. He was a different kind of lawyer, one whose hands bore the scars of fire, whose heart carried the weight of redemption, and whose oath was now sworn not just to the law, but to justice in its truest, most human form. He was building a new foundation, brick by painstaking brick, not on the ruins of others' lives, but on the ashes of his own,